I swore that I would stop lying. I said, I'm going to try not to say anything I know to be untrue. You know, that doesn't mean I swore to tell the truth, because truth, that's hard. But you can consciously stop lying when you know you're lying. You can stop doing that. And that has been revolutionary for me. And one of the things I've really realized in recent years, and this is very much worth knowing, is that many times when people speak to each other, they have an agenda in mind. You know, you want something from someone, maybe you want a job, and you want to craft your image to get the job, right? So you say what you need to say to get what you think you need. The problem with that is, what do you know about what you need? You're so accurate about that, are you? And you think you know what you need exactly, and so you're going to falsify your utterances to bring about the desired end, and you're going to use the other person as a target of your manipulation. Well, that's like you write an essay because that's what the professor wants to hear. It's like you don't do that, because you don't falsify your words, because hypothetically they're divine, and the whole stability of the state rests on them, hypothetically, and maybe really too. And so you don't do that. And so instead you strive to tell the truth, and maybe that's an aim too. And then it's an adventure, because I'll tell you one thing, if you tell the truth, you have no idea what's going to happen to you. Because you have to let go of that. It's like, I'm going to say what I think, and then what I'm going to assume, faith, I'm going to assume that whatever happens, if I am telling the truth, is the best thing that could happen, because the truth brings about what is best. And even if it looks hard for me, because it might be, you know, because people take the easy way out often when they lie, even if it looks bad for me, that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means I don't see the whole picture. And you know, if you believe that the truth will set you free, and that there is such a thing as the truth, and that the truth is redemptive, then you're pretty much stuck with that conclusion. But one of the remarkable things about that, and this really is worth knowing, is that if you do that, you will have your adventure. Right? That's the Abrahamic adventure, you know? The call from God that justifies your life because of the excitement of what you're doing. And the truth does that. And then if it's the truth, man, it's your adventure. Because what bloody adventure are you having if you tell someone else's story? It's not yours. And maybe if it's not yours, it's not good enough for you. And then you suffer, and then you're bitter, and then you're cruel, and then you're resentful. That's not good, or you get arrogant. So you break up your life, you know, into practicalities, your career, your education, your intimate relationship, your marriage, your friendship. Hopefully your intimate relationship and your marriage are the same thing. Your use of time outside work, your civic duty, you know, and you develop an image for yourself, a vision for yourself on all those fronts, and assume that you can have, with the proper sacrifices, what you need and want. And then I'll say something interesting about that, because that's the pursuit of goods in a practical way, right? And what's valuable in a practical way, in an implementable way. And you pick those pathways and you dedicate yourself to their optimization along any of those axes. And then you learn to optimize an aim. And then you see, once you've learned to optimize an aim across a set of goods, you start to aim at what unites those goods. Because that's what makes goods good. It's whatever is common across a set of goods. That's the highest good, or a higher good. And so by practicing any good in any rigorous sense and making the proper sacrifices in that direction, you simultaneously learn to approach the good that is the sum or the essence of all those proximal goods. And I would say that the essential insistence in Christianity is that the good that unites all those goods is the same good that's reflected in the image of Christ, which is an image of acceptance of the suffering of life and the necessity of serving the lowest as the highest calling. And that's something, and it might be true, like really, actually 100% true, more true than anything else, and I actually think it is. And if that is real, then why in the world would you ever attempt to do anything else? And it's kind of earth-shattering in some sense to take this with real seriousness, you know. It's all very frightening. If you're not afraid of that vision, you know, and what it implies for you and your soul, then you didn't understand it. But it's also an unbelievably, what would you say, endlessly promising vision of what your life could be. And you know, you might think, well, I need a life so rich that I can justify its suffering. And that's really asking for something, because there's no shortage of suffering in life. And no one thinks their own suffering isn't real. And maybe there's a possibility that there's some aim that's so high that the attempt alone to move in that direction is of sufficient value to act as a panacea for the suffering. And so you could say at the end of your life, oh my God, that was so hard. It was worth it. And so that's the choice you make at the crossroads. If you have any sense, look for happiness. And everyone thinks, well, I'd rather be happy than miserable. And like, fair enough, but there's nothing about that has any nobility. And it's not believable. No one believes that, because everyone knows that life is bounded by tragedy and that malevolence abounds. Everyone knows that. Yeah. So, and you say, so there's that terrible dark dyad of tragedy and evil, and you wave the little flag of happiness in front of it. It's like, no one believes that will work. But then when you tell people, look, you're dark, you're a monster, you really are, but that's actually useful, because you cannot survive the world without being a monster. People think, well, that's interesting. I kind of suspected that I was a monster, and everyone's always said that was bad. It is bad, obviously, but there's something that can be done about it, and that's something that can be transmuted into something good without being inhibited. Yeah. So you're saying, to be good, I don't have to be a neutered tomcat. To be good, I can be a monster, but I can be like a civilized monster. It's like, yeah, that's what you should aim at. You should be unbelievably dangerous. The more dangerous you are, the better. And then you should control that.
Because that's your doctrine on what constitutes morality, right? It's contained capacity for malevolence.
For mayhem.
For mayhem.
Absolutely. And I learned this partly from Jung, but also partly from Nietzsche. And of course, Jung learned it partly from Nietzsche, because Nietzsche pointed out that most of what passes for morality is just obedient cowardice. Yeah. So I'm an obedient coward. Well, no one wants to think that. So they say, well, no, I'm not an obedient coward. I'm a good person because I don't break any rules. It's like, no, you're not. You're an obedient coward, and you're too afraid to break the rules. That doesn't make you good. It also accounts for why the dark hero, the anti-hero, is so popular in cinematic representations in particular, because people go and watch the mafia hitmen and guys like that, and they, there's a dark part of them that thinks, wow, those guys are really cool. Like movies like Quentin Tarantino's movies, where the hitmen are wisecracking and, they're tough and they can handle everything. And you think, well, these guys are psychopathic criminals. Why are people looking up to them? It's because, well, you're not moral if you're just harmless. And the question is, well, what's the antidote to being harmless? And the antidote to that is to open up that doorway into the shadow. And then you could become that, right? There's that gleeful, predatory victory that's part of that, and that would be associated with, let's say, the attitude that I could have had to what happened with Channel 4. It's like, I won. Yeah. Look the fuck out. Right. But no, that's not right, because it's not good enough. It's better than losing by a lot, because there's nothing in a loss that's admirable, but it's not the highest form of victory, and there's no reason not to go for the highest form of victory, and that's peace. Right? It's not predatory victory, it's peace, because anyone with any sense, who has any wisdom, regards peace as the goal. And that isn't the peace that means that I'm so afraid of you that I'm not going to say anything. It's the peace it's the peace of armed opponents who respect one another. Right, that's real peace. The more radical the necessary change, the more pain that accompanies it. Like the more opportunity as well. And a lot of what we learn painfully. And so it's not surprising that people shrink away from learning. We learn in pain and anxiety very frequently. Everyone knows that. It's like the things that you really learned in life, it's like, it was no joy, man. Like, it took you out. And so the fact that people flee from that is hardly surprising. But it doesn't help, that's the thing. It just stores up the catastrophe for later. And so the better idea is to eat a little poison every day so that you don't have to overdose in a month. It's something like that. And it is the case that I think because you aren't forced to, first of all, you don't learn unless you're forced to learn. I know there's alternatives to that. There's the voluntary search for knowledge, and that's a fine thing, and that is an antidote to this. But apart from that, speaking more practically, you tend not to learn unless you're forced to learn, and what you tend to learn by force are difficult lessons. And so people are very prone to not seek that out. It's not surprising, but it's because they don't understand the consequences very well. It's because they're convinced that there's some way of forestalling the necessary learning, and there isn't any way of forestalling it. All you do is make it worse in the future. You make yourself smaller, and you make the lesson harder. And so that's why in so many religious doctrines there's emphasis on humility. And humility isn't to debase yourself. It's to understand that you don't know enough so that your life isn't going to be miserable. And so every chance you get to grab something new that will help you along your way, you should take it as fast as you can. But you have to have a very tragic, I would say, view of reality, and also a harsh one, because it's not just tragedy, it's also malevolence. You have to understand that those are waiting for you, and that makes you desperate enough to learn, and that might make you desperate enough to fall out of your ideology. But that's a hard way of looking at the world. You organize your perceptions in relationship to a goal. So, for example, if I want to walk across the stage, then I'll specify my endpoint, and I'll see that in high resolution. And then I specify the pathway, and the observation of that untrammeled pathway produces positive emotion, because positive emotion is an index of an untrammeled pathway towards a valued goal, which is also something that's very interesting to know, because it suggests that there's no positive emotion without a goal. It also suggests that the more noble the goal, the more complete and elevated the positive emotion. And that could be true. That could be true, and it's the case as well that when you organize your perceptions around a goal, that provides a container for your negative emotions. So if I want to walk across the stage because I think that getting to the other side is preferable to being here, so that's a hierarchy of value, that place is better than this place, then when I observe myself undertaking the actions that will get me to that place, that's comforting and provides security, because it shows that the structure that I'm using to organize my perceptions and to reduce the world to manageability is sufficiently accurate so that I can implement it. And so we seem to inhabit those structures all the time. Whenever we're looking at the world, whenever we're interacting, we specify a goal, and so that's an ethical enterprise, and we organize our emotions within the specification of that goal, and then we produce hierarchies of goals. So, you sit down in front of your computer so you can write a paper, and you write a paper so that you can finish an essay, and you finish an essay so that you can get a grade in a class, and get a grade in a class so that you can graduate with a degree, and you do that so that you can get a job, and you do that so that you can be, a good husband, a good wife, a good citizen, and you do that so you can be a good person. There's a hierarchy of ethic that permeates the entire enterprise, right from the microcosm up to the macrocosm, and I think that's something like the whole landscape of religious value, with the outermost container, so be a good person, let's say, that's the ultimate aim of the religious enterprise. That's something like the imitation of Christ in the most fundamental sense, and all the things that you do within that are a reflection of that, or you're confused and chaotic. And if everyone's doing that at the same time, then you have a society that's integrated and aiming up and capable of telling the truth. So what's the proposition here? Well, I think when we describe these frameworks of perception, the name we give to the description of a framework of perception is a story. And I think the reason that we like stories so much is because we need to establish frameworks of perception in order to operate in the world and to allow ourselves to be integrated peacefully with other people. And so we're extraordinarily interested in anything that has a narrative basis. And the reason we're interested in that is because we're trying to build within ourselves and collectively the structure that enables us to perceive the world without undue confusion and chaos, and in a manner that provides some value to us and some sustainability. That's the goal overall. And that seems to me to be the goal of the entire religious enterprise. And so, is it possible that, well, I guess that's the claim I thought I'd elaborate out a little bit today, is that the Bible is true in a very strange way. It's true in that it provides the basis for truth itself. And so it's like a meta-truth, right? Without it, there couldn't even be the possibility of truth. And so maybe that's the most true thing. The most true thing isn't some truth per se, it's that which provides the precondition for all judgments of truth. And it seems to me that I can't see any holes in that argument. And I can't see any holes in it from a scientific perspective either, because I think we do know well enough now as scientists that the problem of deriving ethical direction from the collection of facts is an intractable problem. There's too many facts. There's an infinite number of facts. They do not provide an unerring guide for action. They can't. There's too many of them. They have to be prioritized. And as soon as they are prioritized, well, then you're in the ethical domain. And then that begs the question, what's the valid ethical domain? And the postmodern answer is, well, there isn't one. It's all the expression of domination and power. And I think that's nonsense. I don't think that's a tenable solution. I think that we stumbled onto the proper answer in some sense in our religious enterprise, which is that we aim at what's highest, or we don't. We aim at what's highest jointly, or we're divided. We aim at what's highest, and that gives meaning to all the things we do that are subordinate parts of that. We aim at what's highest, and that's what collects us and gives us structure, all of that, singly and jointly. And that's all what we've been trying to communicate all these centuries as we've been trying to communicate the whole religious corpus, generation after generation, and to sort this out and to straighten it out and to try to understand it. And I think that's where we're at now, maybe a little bit more conscious of what this all means, and maybe a little bit more capable of being more certain as people of the book that the faith we have in the textual corpus that we inhabit is we just haven't done better than that. And we strive to flesh it out, we strive to understand it, but fundamentally, it seems to be true in that fundamental sense that I just described, which is not merely true, but the precondition for truth itself.
Why don't you set your family right? You need siblings, maybe you don't have them. Set your relationship with your parents right. Fix your relationship with your father, with your mother, with your siblings. The same thing. And then what sort of relationship do you want to have with your children? If you could have what you wanted. I had a very good relationship with my children. My daughter, as I said, was very ill, so that made things complicated. But I had a great relationship, and still do, with my son. It's one of the lights of our life. And we concentrated on making that relationship pristine, both of us, and my wife as well. And so you imagine, I want my son to love me. I want my son to respect me, and vice versa. I want a child who can make mature decisions. I want someone I can rely on. I want someone who other people gravitate towards. Because I can have what I want if I'm willing to make the proper sacrifices. And so that's a good thing. Could you set your family straight? Well, you need a job or a career. So what can you offer, and what can you bring the world in that regard? And
And then I would say, well, if you're thinking about career success in this Tower of Babel manner, then that's a temptation. But you might think, well, how much good could I do if I had the opportunity in the shortest possible period of time, if I went all in? And then there's an aim, man, there's an aim. And then you might think, well, what would that look like? You know, if I was a light to my community, if I was a light to the people I work with, who would I be if I was like that? And then you can conceptualize that, and you can see when you deviate from it, and why couldn't you correct for the deviations and move towards that? And then you might say, well, are you going to make productive use of your time outside of work? Productive and generous use of your time? Productive, generous, and meaningful use of your time. How about that? You're going to control your susceptibility to temptation, regulate your alcohol and drug use, because alcoholism takes out lots of people. Regulate your sexual temptation. You can control yourself for some reason that's worth controlling yourself for. You know, because there's something to being sybaritic. There's at least the momentary pleasure. It's not nothing. And you're not going to sacrifice that, if you have any sense, unless you sacrifice it to something clearly better.
Get your goals straight and continue to practice every day. And if you're not succeeding, then make your goals slightly smaller. You want to make your goals large enough so that they challenge you, but small enough so that you have a reasonable probability of succeeding at them on a day-to-day basis. And then you have to also understand that if you fail on a given day, like let's say you're trying to quit smoking and you quit for 2 weeks, and then you have a cigarette and you think, oh my God, now I've screwed it up. I'm not quitting anymore. You smoke a whole pack of cigarettes. It's like, well, there's a couple of mistakes there. And one is, well, just because you had a cigarette doesn't mean you failed. It just means that you had a cigarette. You can start stopping again the next day. And the fact that you had 1 cigarette in the last 2 weeks is a hell of a lot better than the 2 weeks that you had before that. And so you've got to be realistically humble. You've got to be ambitious enough in your goals so that you're pursuing something that you regard as truly meaningful and worthwhile. You know, and maybe you can judge that to some degree if you think about someone you love attempting the same thing, and think about how you would feel if they managed it. And if you would feel good, then that's probably a good what would you say? That would be a good evaluation strategy to use on yourself. So you want your goals to be of sufficient nobility so that you can live with yourself properly if you're pursuing them, but you want them to be small enough so that you have a reasonable probability of implementing.
I had lots of clients and students who were chaotic in their orientation to life. They didn't know what to do, and they didn't know what to do about not knowing what to do. It's like, I don't know what to do with my life, and I don't know what to do about my ignorance. And my reaction to that, in some sense, wasn't exactly the reaction of a clinician, because not a typical clinician, because typical clinicians are liberal Protestant in their fundamental orientation, and they tend to think of psychological development as something like self-actualization, right? It's really a self-development process. But that wasn't my observation, partly influenced by the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. I had a more communitarian view of human development than that, and my observation was that most people find the cardinal meanings in their life not as a consequence of the development of their self, whatever that is, but in service to other people, in the adoption of responsibility. You know, because you're told, be responsible, and it's a finger-wagging thing again, you know, that if you were a good person, you be responsible, you do your duty. But no one ever says, well, because that's where you find the abiding meaning in your life, and you need that meaning to sustain you through suffering. And that's definitely the case. You know, I was very ill for a number of years, and a lot of what got me through that wasn't my own special nature, let's say, but the support of my family and the support of my friends and the support of the broader community made a huge difference, not only psychologically, because I knew people were supporting me, but also practically. You build yourself a community. You sacrifice yourself in the service of other people, not so much because you should, although you should, but because that is where meaning is to be found, and you need a deep meaning to sustain you through tragedy. That's the arc. And you find that deep meaning, and you know, there's a notion that it's better to give to receive than to receive, and it sounds like a Hallmark greeting card in some sense. And people are cynical about that too. Well, yeah, you say that because you should be good and think that. But if you watch yourself, you'll see that it's true, because one of the things that's been really pronounced element in my life is that, you know, people thank me from time to time from
for things that I've done or said. And there isn't a better experience than that, that you've put something out that's actually a manifestation of what you truly believe, and the consequence of that is part of the redemptive process for someone else. There is nothing that's better than that. Zero, nothing. In fact, I don't think there's anything that's even in the same conceptual universe of that in terms of its intrinsically rewarding properties. There's nothing better than to have people, perhaps particularly people you've never met, tell you that what you have been doing has had a salutary effect on their lives. And so that's a hell of a fine thing to aim for. And why not aim for it, because you could do it. If you put, I wouldn't even say necessarily that you put other people first, because I think that's a mistake, but I do think it's the case that you treat other people in the manner that you would wish to be treated if you were treating yourself properly. And that's also a sophisticated thing, right? To learn to treat yourself properly. Because that doesn't mean you get to fulfill every momentary whim, because that's what you do when you're 2, and 2-year-olds can't live without their parents. You have to be wise enough to govern your current behavior in light of the future. And that's really what it means to be an adult. It's what it means to forestall gratification and to attain the responsibility of an adult. And the reason that you should do that, because you should, is because it's actually better, in all ways. It's a panacea for suffering to adopt that responsibility. I would tell my clients and students as well, it's like, well, let's just take a look at where other people find meaning. And we'll see how your life matches with that. Do you have an intimate relationship? Yes or no? The right answer is yes. Now, maybe not for you, and maybe you don't right now, and maybe you have your reasons not to because you're a singular person in that regard, but probably not. Because that's like a third of life. And so if you don't have that, that might be one of the reasons you're not doing so well. And the fact that you don't have it might be an indication that you're not oriented in the proper direction. Oh, I can give you an example of that. I had many people question me when I was just on tour. This is a question that came up quite rapidly, often in the Q&A sessions. How do I find the right person when I'm dating? How do I find the person who's right for me when I'm dating? And I got that, or on the internet, I got that question like 3 times in a row, and I thought, because I always think this, what about that question? What's wrong with that question? Something wrong with that question. How do I conduct myself so that I am the best possible partner? Now that's a whole different, right? That's a whole different conceptual universe, and virtually no one ever asked that question. And I would say, well, if you want an answer to the first question, which is how do I find the person who's right for me, you actually start by asking the second question, which is what can I bring to the table for someone else? And if you're really good at bringing something to the table for someone else, hey man, people might be lining up to be your partner. And if they're not, then you might think, well, maybe I'm just not bringing the right thing to the table. And that's worth thinking, especially if you're desperate, you're lost, and you're alone. It's like, maybe I got this wrong. And I usually sort of top that with the suggestion that even if you did find the person who was perfect for you, and they're that perfect, what makes you think they wouldn't take one look at you and run screaming away? And they likely would if they were that perfect, because, really, are you that much of a catch? And if you think you are, that might be part of the problem. So that's one, right? Intimate relationship. So I would say to you at the crossroads, develop a vision for your relationship. There's a gospel saying, which is, of course, impossible to comprehend or believe. Knock and the door will open, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find. And people think, well, no way, the world's not constituted like that. It's like, it goes back to the idea of aim. If you don't aim at it, you're not going to hit it. And it might also go back to a question about what do you mean by ask and what do you mean by want? Because it isn't just some casual request. You're praying to God, I wish I could find my wallet or something like that, as if he's the casual granter of magical wishes, like a fairy with a magic wand. It's not that. Asking means something like this: I am willing to give up everything that I'm doing wrong so that I can put things right, if I could know what right was. And that's you're on your knees when you say that, man. And maybe if you're on your knees, you get the answer. And so that's worth thinking about. So, if you knocked and you wanted to walk through and you asked and you wanted to learn, and you sought because you wanted to find, maybe you would receive and be answered and find.
but not without aim. And so I might say, well, look, if you could have the relationship you wanted, you get to have the relationship you want and need, but you have to know what it is. And so then you need a vision of that. It's like, and a developed vision, you know? Not, I need to find the person right for me. It's like, what do you mean by that? No. How are you going to treat your partner when they come home from work? How about something that concrete? Or how would you like to be treated when you come home from work? Or what sort of partner do you want in relationship to their attitude towards children? You have to make it real, you know, like it's the story of your own life, which, by the way, it is. And then maybe you find it, because at least once you've developed the vision, if it manifests itself, you'll recognize it. That's something.
Not only do you have to move from point A to B in life, but point A is often a very difficult place to be, because we're fragile and bounded and mortal and limited, and because we know that. And so one of the implications of that, as many great religious traditions are at pains to illustrate or demonstrate or proclaim, is that life is essentially suffering. And I believe that to be a fundamental truth. But perhaps not the most fundamental truth, because I think the most fundamental truth is that despite the fact that life is suffering, people can transcend that. And partly the way they transcend that is by pursuing things of value. And so that if there is no value proposition at hand, then you have no meaning to justify the difficult conditions of your life. And that's brutally difficult for people. You know, Nietzsche said, he who has a why can bear any how. And you see, and I've certainly seen this as a clinical practitioner, that people who have no purpose in their life are embittered by the difficulties of their life. And they become first bitter, and then resentful, and then revengeful, and then cruel. And there's plenty of places to go past cruel. That's just where you start if you're really on a downhill path. You know, we kind of have this idea that, well, you're free as a child, and then you, let me see if I can put this properly, that you have a certain delightful, wonderful, positive freedom as a child, and then that's given up as you approach adulthood. But the truth of the matter is that you have a lot of potential as a child, but none of that is capable of manifesting itself as freedom before you become disciplined. And discipline is a matter of the imposition of order, and the order is necessary, especially for people who are hopeless and nihilistic. And lots of people are hopeless and nihilistic, way more people than you think. And part of that is because no one's ever really encouraged them. And so the book is in part a matter of encouragement. It's like, lay a disciplinary structure on yourself, get the chaos in check, and then you can move towards a state that's freer, because it's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. And so in virtually every freedom that you have in life that's true freedom is purchased at the price of discipline. Before you can be a painter who can paint what's beyond mere memory, you have to inculcate that discipline skill, and a lot of that is painful repetition and hard grinding work. It's the sacrifice of the present for the future. But once you manage that, then things open up. And virtually everything you learn of value is like that's very, very, very difficult to learn to write. And there's arbitrary rules that you have to follow and bind yourself to. And while you're learning those rules, the probability that you have any creative freedom to speak of or any facility with the rules is very low. You're a rank beginner. And even to some degree, whatever creativity you have is going to have to be stifled while you're passing through that keyhole. But if you pass through it, then something massive opens up on the other side. And it is definitely the case that disciplinary institutions, universities, are exactly that, is they're places of guidance, and they're places to encourage people to develop the discipline that's necessary to see beyond the discipline. I mean, that's why we have disciplines, right? I mean, the words aren't there by accident. You have to narrow yourself first, and then you can broaden outward. And so that's part of the process of maturation. That's part of the sacrifice of childhood. Say, in childhood you're nothing but potential, but it's not realized, and you don't know how to realize it. And so then the question is, well, how do you get to a point where you realize the potential? And the answer is, you sacrifice almost all of it to a single direction. This is Nietzsche's commentary on the Catholic Church. He's a great admirer of the Catholic Church, despite the fact that he was also a radical critic of Christianity. He said, the thing about the Catholic Church is that it forced everything to be interpreted within a single explanatory framework. And that was a discipline. And once that discipline was established, then the disciplined mind could explode in every direction, which is precisely what happened. And so, and that's the thing about growing up, is that when you're a teenager and a young adult, you have to sacrifice everything you could have been as a child to be the one thing that you're aiming at. But then that opens up, and the universities are part and parcel of that process. And you need the guidance, because the library is too large to wander through it unaided. Many times in life, people don't get what they want and they need because they don't aim at it. And it's a hard lesson for people to learn, because they're cynical to begin with, and they presume that there's no possible way of moving forward. But it's not so unreasonable to assume that you're not going to hit what you don't aim at, or you're not going to hit what you aim at and don't shoot at. And I've seen time and time again that if people do put forward a vision for what they regard as worthy of pursuit, which is something you have to determine in dialogue with yourself. It's like, given the difficult preconditions of existence, is there anything that you could conceive of that you would regard as sufficiently worthwhile so that you would be motivated to pursue it? It's a profound philosophical question, and it's not an unreasonable one. It's a good place to start. It's like, well, life is difficult enough to make you cynical and bitter, and perhaps enough to make you cynical and bitter and suicidal and homicidal and even genocidal. And it's not surprising in some sense. And then the question is, well, is there something that you can pursue that allows that to be acceptable, or perhaps even desirable, which is something to do that justifies the suffering? And it's hard to say what that would be for each of you. It's something that you can discover. This is partly why Nietzsche was wrong. Nietzsche thought that after God had died, that human beings would have to invent their own values. But the psychoanalysts, I would say Jung foremost among them, put forward a very powerful counterclaim, which was that, well, you can't invent values. They're already built into you. You have to discover them. And I think that's true for each person. It's like, well, what would justify you in the abandonment of your resentment and hostility? What would be a sufficiently adventurous goal? You have to be humble and wise enough to understand that you might have to aim pretty damn low, especially in those places where you're not functioning well. And it might be so embarrassing that you can't bring yourself to fathom that that's actually who you are. But, you know, Jung described the fool, the archetypal figure of the trickster and the fool, as the precursor to the savior, to the redeemer. And that's an unbelievable bit of wisdom, because what Jung meant was that to put yourself together, which is to follow the path of redemption, to follow the redeemer. If the redeemer is a type of personality that you could in fact be inhabited by or manifest, then the first steps towards that is to allow yourself to be a fool, right? It's because you don't know what you're doing. You have to admit that. And there's going to be a loss of ego or destruction of ego, arrogant ego that necessarily accompanies that. But you need the loss of that arrogant ego, because it's precisely what's interfering with your movement forward. You know, it's part of the adversarial process, mythologically speaking, that stops moral progress. You're too proud of who you think you are to notice what you're like so that you could change properly. You don't want to sacrifice that part of yourself. It's probably associated with some delusion that helps you maintain, what would you say, a positive, although very fragile self-image, you know, in the absence of genuine effort. Met a woman once in my clinical practice, man, this was something. She was as damaged a person as you could hope to contemplate. So she looked like a street person. She'd come to this behavior therapy clinic that I worked in as a student, and she was dressed like a street person. You know, she had this old ratty winter jacket on that was really dirty, and she stooped over. She wasn't very tall to begin with. She stooped over, hunched over, and she approached everyone like this, which made people shy away from her because it's an odd method of approach. But the reason she did that was she was really so timid and so humble that it was as if anybody that she approached had a light that was emanating from them too unbearable for her to behold. So it wasn't so much an oddity, although it was, as a preternatural humility. And I thought she had come to the behavior clinic because she wanted help. She was an outpatient at a psychiatric hospital that I worked at. And she couldn't communicate very well, partly because of her shyness, partly because her first language was French, which maybe she could communicate perfectly well in French, but I doubt it. She was not an intelligent person, technically speaking. You know, she was intellectually impaired, and probably in the bottom 10th percentile of the population. That's a pretty rough place to exist cognitively. You know, you're barely literate at that point. And her mother was very ill and was bedridden, and her mother had a boyfriend who was a violent alcoholic schizophrenic who was always haranguing her about Satan, and man, she had a rough life. She just didn't have anything going for her. She wasn't an attractive person physically, you know. People shied away from her. She just was the downtrodden of the earth, you know, in the realist sense. And that bloody woman, you know, she actually came to that behavior therapy clinic. She'd been an inpatient. And this was a rough place, man, because it was a hospital after deinstitutionalization, and there were tunnels connecting some of the wards to other wards because it's so cold. This was in Montreal. It's so cold in the winter. They built a hospital on these tunnels, and I took my brother there one day, and it was like walking through Dante's Inferno. I mean, if you were so psychiatrically impaired that you weren't released in the 1980s when deinstitutionalization was maybe at its peak, you were so damaged that there was just no possibility that you could function in the outside world. So the people that were left were sort of the most demolished of the most demolished. And so just walking through there for my brother, who had no experience in such things, was traumatizing, you know. And she had been in the inpatient ward for some time and then was released, and she wanted to talk to the hospital administration because she got out and she got this dog that she took care of and went for a walk, and she really liked this dog and she took care of it, you know, and she walked with it, and she wanted to see if she could go find one of those inpatients who was worse off than her and take them for a walk every day with her dog. You know, it's so funny, you meet someone like that and they just have nothing. They have nothing in the world that you would recognize as any marker of success or status or ability, or they're outcast and tortured, and then nonetheless, you know, a woman in that dismal state was able to rise above her own catastrophe, which was like manifold, and find someone worse off to try to serve. You know, you don't need many experiences like that to convince you that there's things about the world that you truly don't understand on the ethical front, you know. So I would say, when you're at the crossroads and you're counseled to despair, you know, rise up in courage and see if you can resist it. It's better for you and it's better for the people around you. You know, I was reading a Wikipedia article on the Tower of Babel the other day. I'm always curious about how these things are represented most publicly, right? And Wikipedia is a great way to do that because it's collectively edited. And the interpretation was essentially, it was the description of how the languages of the world arose. And I don't think that's what that story's about at all, except peripherally. I thought, yeah, you just missed the point 100%. I mean, Babel is Babylon first, so you need to know that. And Babylon is the state that's gone mad. And it's a continual temptation for human beings to build complex organizations, right, that get too high. And so what does that mean? How about too many layers? Not local enough, not distributed enough, right? Too separate from the people that they serve. I think the EU did that. I think that's why the British left. That's the Tower of Babel. In fact, unbelievably, they used a famous painting of the Tower of Babel as a representation of the EU in some of their literature, which I think it was a painting by Bruegel, but I'm not sure of that. But that was just like, okay, I just do not understand how that happened at all. In any case, this Tower of Babel, it's also a Luciferian story. You know, Lucifer is the spirit of intellect, the light bringer, who's flown too high and challenges God himself and falls. And in Milton's story, Lucifer is called on his pretension by God and said, you know, because he is God's highest angel, God most catastrophically wrong. So a symbol of intellect, that in combination with the notion that he's a light bringer, it's a symbol of prideful intellect. And it is the prideful intellect that raises itself against what is most properly placed at the highest place, which is what God is, whatever that is. Whatever it is, it's not the intellect. That's a subordinate spirit. And if it isn't, then it becomes aimed essentially at something approximating hell and perfectly capable of creating it and then perfectly capable of ruling in it. And so when God calls Lucifer on his rebellion, he says, if you but repent, you could be welcomed home. And Lucifer says, well, I am the sort of spirit that even if I once repented, I would be instantly tempted to merely repeat my mistake. And he says as well, I would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. It's like, hey man, there's a choice for you at the crossroads. And so, you know, people have asked me, for example, I'm very opposed to the idea that the fundamental human motivation is power, which is pretty much what every student is taught at every level of their education, in every educational institution, except a handful now across your country. Fundamental motivation is power. There's no place for people of goodwill to meet and engage in constructive dialogue, dialogos, none of that, because our fundamental motivation is nothing but the will to power. And so there is no place for people of goodwill to meet. There is no such thing as dialogue. It's all a mask, a rationalization, a post hoc rationalization for pretension and power. It's such a dismal philosophy. It's so you could not, and I believe this technically, you could not formulate a more pathological philosophy. It obliterates your faith in society, and it eradicates the notion of the individual. It removes the notion of good faith and goodwill, and it makes communication impossible. It's like, that's a temptation to engage in that sort of destruction as a consequence of your intellectual pretensions, let's say. And for all of you, this is going to face you too, this pretension, you know. So maybe you're not the hopeless type, and the temptation that assails you at the crossroads isn't your degeneration into a kind of faithless nihilism. Maybe it's a self-aggrandizement in some sense instead, and that you feel that now you have the opportunity to serve your own ambition. Psychopaths serve their own ambition. And they're the people who are most truly motivated by power, by the way, if you think about it clinically. And they're not very successful, all protestations to the contrary. They never rise above about 3% of any general population. And maybe it's a better strategy to be a manipulative psychopath than to lay inert in your bed, in your mother's bedroom when you're 40, but it's not an optimal strategy. And so you can get away with it being a psychopath because you can mimic competence and you can take advantage of people who have learned to expect the best from others, and so you can manipulate them. But you produce nothing on your own. And one of the things that's really interesting about psychopaths is they don't learn from experience, which means not only do they betray other people constantly, but they betray their own future selves. And there's really no difference between your future self and someone else, right? You know, if you're going to act ethically, and this is a very good way of thinking about acting ethically, you act in a way that works for you now, that works for you tomorrow, that works for you next week and next month and next year and in 5 years and in 10 years, and for you and your family and your friends and your broader community, and all of that simultaneously. And that's a place to find purpose in your life, to manage that balancing act simultaneously, and to sacrifice your narrow, self-oriented pretensions, ambition, all of that, the celebration of your own intellect, the construction of your own empire for your own narrow purposes. Part of the reason you shouldn't do that, even though it's tempting in some sense, especially if you have the ability, is because, do you want to rule over hell? I mean, and that's another interesting question with regards to the question of whether power is a valid motivation. It's like, okay, well, Kim Jong-un, let's take him. He's a manifestation of a power player. You think it's better to be leader of North Korea than to be just an ordinary peon there? Are you so sure it's better to rule over hell than just to be a servant in hell? It's not obvious to me. That's not success by any stretch of the imagination. The most powerful devil. That's like the worst possible failure. And so, you're called upon to take the lessons that you've been taught in a university like this, that attempts to teach you to abide by the eternal verities, to sacrifice your own narrow pretensions in the highest sense to something that's truly better, not because you should in some finger-wagging sense, but because there is truly nothing better, and perhaps you don't have the wisdom to see that, because it's difficult to see. It's difficult to have a purview broad enough to encompass those expanse of time and community and see what pattern of behavior is to be manifested in proper service to balance all of that in some musical manner. But that's definitely the appropriate pathway. You want to present yourself to the world in a manner that doesn't disgrace you in some sense. That might be a good way to think about it. And you don't want to disgrace yourself, because the consequence of disgrace is emotional dysregulation, more pain, less positive emotion. And so the best way to present yourself is to stand up forthrightly and to stretch out, and to occupy some space, and to you make yourself sort of vulnerable by doing that, because you open up the front of your body, right? But it's a sign of confidence, and that way people are most likely to give you the benefit of the doubt. And that's a good way to start regulating your mood. But not only does it directly regulate your mood to stand up, because it's so tightly associated, like posture reflection is associated with serotonin and emotional regulation, but also because if you straighten up and you present yourself in that manner, then other people are more likely to take you seriously. And that means they'll start treating you as if you're a number 1 lobster instead of a number 10 lobster. And that's another way that you can at least give yourself the bloody benefit of the doubt, right? And confront the world in a courageous manner. Let's say you're a filmmaker and I'm a professor. Okay, so we differ there, right? We're playing a different game. So you might say, and as you go down into the particulars of what we do, it might even become more different. So if you look at what a plumber does and a lawyer does, as you get more and more fine-grained, they get more diverse. But you might say, well, the lawyer and the plumber are both honest. They're both good citizens. And then you might nest that inside, well, they're both acting out the archetype of the hero. And like I said, after that, you're out of the, things get too abstract for us to, we can't go farther than that. I think that, I think the world is order versus chaos, let's say, the balance of order and chaos it's good and evil on a background of order versus chaos. And so you're either the hero or the adversary, or actually most of the time you're a mixture of both. And it's best for you, that's what our culture has decided, it's best for you to take on the role of the hero to the degree that that's possible. And that would be associated with love. And the love, and I define that in the second book particularly, the third book I wrote, but in Beyond Order. Are you working for the betterment of being, or are you working for harm? And everyone has a sense of this, and they know when they're working for harm. Look, it's good for you to go take your place in the world. Have some ambition, have a vision, have a goal, have a strategy. Try to be a good person, not because it's your duty precisely, because that's the proper way to live. We're in danger of undermining all of that, and it's not good for people. One of the things that I've really learned, for example, recently is that learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. So let's say, well, the first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves.
What, do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. You have to negotiate until you come to the best solution that can be negotiated, which isn't necessarily a perfect solution, but it might be the best one that can be done. And then you have to stick with it until the next negotiation. And if you get upset during the negotiations, which you likely will, because these are difficult topics, how to divide up responsibilities in the house, and people get mad because they feel they've been taken advantage of or aren't being listened to. One of the rules was, well, you can leave the discussion, but only until you calm down, and then you have to come back, because these things have to be pushed through. They have to be negotiated through, because the alternative is, well, important things don't get done, or people do them resentfully because they're sort of forced by their own orderliness or their own conscientiousness, or by force, psychological or otherwise, on the part of other people. These things have to be negotiated through. You can tell if you've got the balance between making peace and speaking the truth right if the conversation continues. And it can be emotional and will be and can be difficult because important things have to be dealt with. But as long as the people are still in the conversation and communicating, then you've got the balance right. And you might have to take a break. Maybe you have to hold off till the next day. Maybe sometimes when you're negotiating something that's difficult, you have to offer the other person the opportunity to sleep on their decision too, which I think is often a very good idea. If you have to make an important decision in your life, it's very useful to tell the person that you're negotiating with that, look, I'm interested in this and it seems good, but I'm not going to agree until I sleep on it. It gives you, lots of things happen when you sleep. You organize your brain when you sleep, at least to the degree that you can organize it. And you can often be more solid or more doubtful about a decision if you sleep on it. It is my firm belief that each of us have a responsibility to set the world right in the manner that we are able to, and that is a fundamental import. I really believe in some sense it's of cosmic import, in the same way that consciousness itself is of cosmic import. And consciousness reflects being itself. And I do believe that we have the ability and the responsibility to bring new creation into being, and that our ethical decisions help us, that the value of that new being is dependent directly on the ethical decisions that each of us make. The positive emotion that we find sustaining is experienced in relationship to an unachieved goal. It's hope that drives us forward. We want something, and if we see ourselves moving towards that, then we're in the grip of the positive emotion that we find sustaining. It isn't the attainment. Attainment is satiating. Attainment shuts down the system that has been striving for that particular object of attainment. If you're hungry and you eat, you stop being hungry. Now, that's good because the hunger is gone, but that whole frame disappears. You can no longer strive within that frame, and you need a new frame to strive towards. And so technically, and this is well established as far as I'm concerned, we even know the drugs that people abuse, cocaine, let's say, amphetamines, the ones that are potent sources of positive emotion, activate the system that regulates our emotional response to evidence that we're moving towards a desired goal. So cocaine, for example, is an exhilarating drug. It makes you feel that things are worthwhile because it hijacks the system that does indicate that things are worthwhile. So this is deeply, this striving aspect is deeply rooted in our biology, for obvious reasons. There is inequality. What that means is there's always going to be people around that are better at something than you are, and that's a problem, because you can get jealous and you can get bitter and you can get resentful, and worse, you can get hopeless. Because you look like. I have this friend of mine. He told me something so funny. He was decrying his lack of success in the world, and he compared himself to his roommate, and
He said, his college roommate was doing much better than he was. And his bloody roommate was Elon Musk. It's like, really? It's like, oh, you're not doing as well as Elon Musk. Well, you could see it would take it rather personally because they were roommates and everything. It wasn't like he was doing badly. Like he was doing pretty damn well. It's like, I'm not as good as Elon Musk. It's like, yeah, well, you and like 7 billion other people, But I thought it was instructive because you have to be careful who you compare yourself to. Now, you can't just not compare yourself to successful people, right? Because then you don't have anything to aim at.
There is this idea that your great country is founded upon, for example, that each individual is of divine worth. And I made reference to this client I had when I was a junior therapist, and so even the most, what would you say, ignored and alienated, marginalized, let's say, to use a word that's been overused, have something of real value to bring into the world. And this is the case. You're a particularized creature as a son of God or a daughter of God, let's say. You have something to bring into the world that no one else can bring in. And so if you fail in that duty, then you deprive the world of that. And maybe you shouldn't do that. Like maybe everything's lesser if you do that. And you don't know how much lesser, because the world is also constituted in a very strange way. Dostoevsky said that we're not only responsible for what we do, but for what everyone else does, which is truly an insane thing to say, but also in some sense fundamentally true. I don't know how it is that each of us can bear the burden of the world on our shoulders singularly, because I can't really comprehend how things can be structured in that manner, but I do believe nonetheless that it is the case, and so that if you forswear your responsibility to the highest good, then you tear something out of the fabric of being that is of inestimable value. And I do believe you will pay for that if you do it, and I would suggest that you don't pay that price, because it will not be pleasant. That's definitely hell. And if you don't think hell is real, you haven't thought about it enough. It isn't a matter of other people believing foolish things. It's a matter of you being so naive and so well protected that you have no idea how the world is constituted. And so that's the temptations, let's say. Chaos and nihilism and hopelessness, or intellectual pretension and the desire for self-aggrandizement and narrow power. Don't do that. It's not helpful. It won't do you any good. And it's beneath you. It's beneath you to do that. And you that will manifest itself in your life, that subordination of what's highest in you to those lesser gods, let's say. That'll manifest itself in the torments of your own conscience. And no one escapes from that, And so, don't do that. Don't make that choice at the crossroads. And you have another opportunity now to be the next iteration of yourself that you can be. At a crossroads, the metaphor works because you make a decision. You go one direction or another. And there's an old blues idea that you meet the devil at the crossroads. I always wondered why that was. I thought it through. It's a really compelling idea. It's an image that has a good narrative fit, and it sticks in your memory once you hear it. Why do you meet the devil at the crossroads at midnight? Maybe that's when you examine your conscience, or it examines you. And then you might ask, well, why do you meet the devil at the crossroads? And the answer is, most fundamentally, because when you come to a place in your life where you have to make a choice, and I think this is actually true of every choice we ever make, but it's more evident when the choice is more weighty, let's say, as the choices that lay themselves out now in front of you are weighty. You aim up or down. And there's always an agent of temptation at every choice point enticing you to aim down. And I've thought a lot about what aiming down means, and so I'll run through that for a bit. The spirit of temptation, it manifests itself, for example, in the story of Cain and Abel. And so Cain falls prey to temptation, and God bluntly informs him when he complains about his fate that the temptation was freely chosen and that he could have done differently and better. And Cain becomes This is in the aftermath of the improper sacrifices that he makes. The sacrifices that he makes that are not everything they could be. They're not in the service of the highest good, that are deceptive and arrogant simultaneously, because when we make improper sacrifices, we believe in the deepest part of ourselves that we've pulled one over God. And I suggest that that's a temptation you might want to avoid, that presumption. And then you might say, well, if you're tempted to aim down, you're tempted to make improper sacrifices, you're tempted to arrogantly presume that you are going to get away from it, with it, that you're not going to be called on it. What are the pathways down that might manifest themselves in front of you? And I think the two stories that follow the story of Cain and Abel detail that. So after Cain and Abel comes the flood. And that's no accident. The narrative placement of those stories is definitely no accident. It's unbelievably sophisticated from a literary perspective, a philosophical perspective, theological perspective, existential perspective. One form of temptation is the nihilistic chaos that's symbolically represented by the flood, right? It's the proliferation of sins. And sin is a word, both its Greek and its Hebrew derivation are related to archery. So the Greek derivation, I hope I haven't got this wrong, because I know there are Greek scholars in this audience. So the word is derived from the Greek word hamartia, which means to miss the mark, and it's an archery term. It's a lovely notion to know that, because to sin therefore means to miss the target, which implies that it has something to do with aim or the lack thereof. I love that. I think it's so apt. And the derivation of the word sin from the Hebrew source actually relies on the same imagery. And so to sin is to aim wrong or to miss the mark. And there's a variety of ways you can miss the mark, right? Don't aim at all. That's a good one. Assume there is no such thing as aim. Assume all aims are equal. Well, you sin, you miss the mark. What can happen? Well, one way is you can descend into a kind of nihilistic hopelessness. And that's not... You can understand that. You know, you meet people in life whose lives have been so hard. You know, you hear their stories. They've suffered so much, and they're bitter, and they're hurt, and they're resentful. And you think, oh my God, it's no wonder you're bitter and hurt and resentful. I mean, look what you've gone through. But you also notice that their bitterness and their resentment and their hopelessness and their chaos and their anxiety, it's not helping, right? It's worsening the problem. It's not making it better. And I'm not saying that people can always resist that. But I've certainly seen that it's not helpful. But I've also met other people, you know, who have had stories equally catastrophic, sometimes more catastrophic, sometimes so catastrophic you can't even believe that they survived, who are not embittered or made resentful by those experiences, and who continue to aim up. And so that makes a mockery of a kind of casual determinism, right? Is that you end up chaotic, nihilistic, hopeless, anxious, etc., merely as a consequence of the unbearable tragedy of your life. Because if that was the case, then everyone who had a series of unbearable tragedies, which, by the way, will be almost all of us in one way or another at one time or another, would end up in that catastrophic chaos that if manifested broadly enough in a society, produces a flood that ends everything. We have this idea, it's not a good idea, and it's certainly an idea for which religious people are often pilloried, that faith means the sacrifice of reason and the willingness to believe things that are patently not true. And when religious people debate scientists, they're often sort of hung out to dry on exactly those presuppositions, their willingness to accept on principle propositions that seem on the face of them impossible. I don't think that's what faith is at all in some fundamental sense. I think faith is a form of courage. You know, if you're hurt by life, and you will be, it's understandable that you might react in a nihilistic and hopeless fashion and become anxious and depressed and cynical and bitter and all of that. That's a bad pathway. And I think part of what helps you through that is faith. And part of that faith is that it's incumbent upon you, and actually in your best interest and everyone else's, to maintain faith in the fundamental goodness of existence, including your own, despite the evidence to the contrary. Right? Because you can draw conclusions from suffering, and two
ways, right? One is that you have a duty and perhaps the capability to transcend the suffering and still serve the good, or you can derive the conclusion that life is so unbearable that it would be best terminated, which is the conclusion that Goethe as Mephistopheles derives, for example, in Faust. He says, well, the world is rife with suffering, and it's so unbearable that consciousness itself, all beings should cease to exist. That would be better. Nothing is better than something if something is rife with suffering. And you can derive that conclusion, and you'll be driven to it in some of the farther reaches of your life when terrible things happen to you. But I would say faith is the courage to not take that path despite the evidence that that might be justified.